Lieutenant Cody Brantley drove his boot into the mop bucket and sent it skidding across the hangar deck under the nose gear of a $90 million strike fighter, and the gray water went everywhere. He laughed and told the whole hangar the trash needed to stay away from real aircraft. The younger pilots howled. Nora Vance knelt in the puddle and began wiping it up without a single word. Not one of them knew they had just humiliated the finest combat pilot this country ever put in a cockpit. Before we go further, subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end and drop the name of the city you are watching from in the comments so I can see how far Ghost 6 travels. She did not look at him. That was the part that would haunt Cody Brantley later, in the years after, when he had rank on his collar and gray at his temples and a career built on the ruins of who he had been that morning. She did not look at him. She did not flinch, did not argue, did not lift her chin the way people do when they are swallowing something. She simply put her knee down in the water he had spilled on her behalf, wrapped her fingers around the handle of the fallen mop, and set the bucket upright again. The water had already run out under the nose gear in a wide gray sheet. She pulled the rag from her back pocket and worked it in slow circles, soaking, wringing, soaking again the way she had done 10,000 times in 3 years. Brantley told the others she was still cleaning like nothing had happened. He said it loudly because half the pleasure of a thing like that is the audience. And Lieutenant Marcus Pyle laughed because Pyle laughed at everything Brantley said, and 2 other pilots laughed because it is easier to laugh than to be the only one standing quiet. Somebody suggested she probably enjoyed it. Somebody else said it was the most excitement she would get all week. Nora Vance kept wiping. There had been a woman once who would have had an answer for a man like Cody Brantley. A woman who could have put him against a bulkhead with 4 words and left him there for the rest of his life. That woman had commanded men older than Brantley and better than Brantley, and had been obeyed instantly and had never once needed to raise her voice to make a room go still. But that woman was 3 years dead, buried under a set of gray coveralls and a name tape that said "Only Vance" in block letters, buried under the deliberate discipline of being nobody at all. So she said nothing. She wrung the rag out into the bucket, stood, and pushed the cart toward the far end of the hangar, where the overheads were dimmer and nobody could read her face. If any of them had been looking, they might have noticed something. They might have noticed the way her eyes moved along the aircraft as she passed it. Not the way a civilian looks at a fighter with that vague awe people have for expensive, dangerous things. She read the intake seam. She read the leading edge in the canopy line and the state of the tires. She read that machine the way a mother reads the face of her own child across a crowded room in half a second, all of it, everything. But nobody was looking at Nora Vance. Nobody had looked at her in 3 years. That was the entire point, and it had cost her a great deal to arrange. She arrived at Naval Air Station Cape Larkin every morning at 5. She parked her old truck in the far corner of the lot, the corner nobody else wanted because it was the longest walk in the rain. And she clocked in and pushed her cart down passageways that were still dark. She liked the base best when it was empty. She liked the sound of the mop head against the deck and the hum of the fluorescents warming up and the far-off thunder of the first aircraft going up. A person could disappear into work like that. A person could let the hours carry her from one end of the day to the other without ever once having to be somebody. That was all she had wanted for 3 years, and for 3 years she had gotten it, and she had told herself over and over that it was enough. In her left breast pocket, folded so many times the fabric had gone soft, as tissue, was a squadron patch she had never once taken out in front of another human being. Petty Officer Second Class Delia Ruiz found her in the main passageway at 6:15, coffee in one hand and a stack of message folders under the other arm, and said good morning by name. Ruiz was one of maybe 3 people on that base who spoke to Nora Vance like she was a person instead of a fixture. Nora had never asked her why. She suspected Ruiz was simply the kind of woman who could not walk past a human being without acknowledging them, and that such women were rarer than anyone wanted to admit. Ruiz mentioned the big evolution coming up, most of the training wing going up, and said the weather people were promising the ceiling would hold all afternoon. Nora stopped pushing her cart. She looked out toward the tall windows at the end of the passageway, out at the gray water and the sea stacks and the line of cloud building off the Northwest Cape, and something crossed her face that Delia Ruiz did not understand and would not understand for another 5 hours. The ceiling would not hold, Nora told her. There was a squall pushing in ahead of the fog bank, and the fog would come in behind it and sit down on the field, and the approach would go blind sometime between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. It was the kind of weather that lied. It looked like it was leaving right up until the moment it closed the door behind you. She said it plainly, the way a person states the time of day. Then she seemed to hear herself, her face shut like a hatch, and she said something dismissive about how she only pushed a mop and she walked away with her cart before Ruiz could get a question out. Delia Ruiz stood alone in the passageway for a long moment. She looked out at the same water and the same clouds and tried to see whatever it was that woman had just seen, and she could not. It was Skyr. Deep. It was ordinary gray Oregon sky. She wrote it down anyway. Squall then fog 1300 to 1400 approach blind. She did not know why she wrote it. She only knew that when a woman says a thing like that, in a voice like that, a person ought to put it on paper. By 8, the hangar was loud with living. Plane captains shouted over the whine of auxiliary power units. Pilots walked out to their aircraft with helmets under their arms and their flight suits unzipped to the waist because they wanted the world to know exactly what they were. And Nora Vance moved along the edges of all of it, emptying bins, wiping down the coffee machine in the ready room, invisible, while men who had never in their lives been shot at argued about which of them was the better stick. Brantley was holding forth with his boots up on a chair. The simulator did not lie, he said. His scores were the best in the training wing, and second place was not even close. Pyle told him the simulator was not real. Brantley grinned and said it was realer than anything Pyle had ever done, and then he said the thing that made Nora Vance's hands go still on the counter. He said real combat was just a simulator plus fear. And he did not have any fear. She did not react. She had spent 3 years turning her face into a thing that gave nothing back. But something moved inside her that was older and heavier than anger, something closer to grief, because she had known men exactly like Cody Brantley. She had flown with them, she had trained them, and she had listened more than once to the precise moment when the sky stopped being a simulator and became the thing that could kill you, and the fear arrived in a young man's voice for the first time at 19,000 feet, where it is far too late to learn how to carry it. She had held a man's hand once through a radio for 4 minutes on the way down. She had kept her voice warm and level the entire time because that was what he needed, and it was the only thing left she could give him. She remembered the exact second the channel went to static and the exact quality of the silence that followed it, and she had carried that silence into every room she had entered since. Brantley noticed her then for the first time all morning. He asked if she was lost and told her the head was the other way. Nora Vance set down her rag and looked at him. For 1 second, one single second, she let him see her eyes. Not the flat, patient, apologetic eyes of a woman who cleans decks. The other ones. The ones she kept locked in a box she never opened. Cody Brantley, who had just announced to a room full of witnesses that he did not have any fear, felt something cold walk down the center of his spine. His grin came loose at the corners. For a fraction of a heartbeat, he had the specific and terrible sensation of a small animal that has realized far too late that the still shape in the tall grass was never a rock. Then she picked up her rag, and it was gone, and she was only the cleaning lady again. She told him on her way out that the number 4 aircraft had a slow weep on the left feed line and that his plane captain had not caught it yet. Then she pushed her cart out of the ready room and left 5 young pilots sitting in a silence none of them knew what to do with. Pyle asked what the hell that had been. Brantley laughed, but the laugh came out thin, and he heard it come out thin, and he covered it by saying she was a crazy old cleaning lady who did not know a feed line from a garden hose. An hour later, Senior Chief Ray Bertolino pulled the panel on the number 4 aircraft during a routine check and found a slow weep on the left feed line. It was small. It was the kind of fault that would not have shown on any gauge until the aircraft was airborne and committed, and by then it would have been a very different kind of morning. Bertolino stood there with his hands on the panel and a feeling crawling up the back of his neck because there was no way to see that from outside the aircraft. There was no way to know to look, not without instruments, not without 24 years of your own knuckles and your own mistakes, and not without something else he could not put a name to. He asked the airman beside him who had told him to check that bird. The airman said the cleaning lady had. Bertolino looked up. He asked him to say that again. The airman said it again. 24 years of putting pilots into cockpits, and Ray Bertolino turned and looked down the length of that hangar toward the dim far corner where a woman in gray coveralls was quietly stacking chairs. And for the first time since she had come to Cape Larkin, he actually looked at her, not past her, at her. And he thought with the peculiar clarity that comes to men who work with machines that he had absolutely no idea who that person was. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Osei had been asking the same question for 4 months. Osei ran base security, and he prided himself on knowing everything that happened inside the fence. He knew which sailors were coming back over the wall after curfew. He knew which contractors padded their invoices. He knew the name of every dog living in base housing and most of the cats. Daniel Osei was a noticing man, and what he had begun to notice is slowly, one small impossible thing at a time, was the custodian. It had started at the range. He had been watching a live fire evolution from the observation deck, and he had glanced down and seen her standing off to one side, and it had taken him a full minute to understand what was bothering him. She was not standing where a civilian stands. She was not standing where it feels safe. She was standing in the one position on that entire range that accounted for ricochet geometry and blast angle, the actual safe place. The place it had taken him 9 years and 2 very bad afternoons to learn. She had walked to it without appearing to think about it at all. He had filed it away. Then there was the morning a backup radio in the tower had died and 2 technicians had spent 2 hours failing to bring it back. Osei had walked in to find the custodian emptying a bin, and he could have sworn, though he could never have proved it, in a hearing that she had glanced at the exposed board and her lips had moved slightly, the way a person's lips move when they are reading, and that she had looked away the instant she felt him watching. He filed that away too. And then there was the way she watched aircraft. Everyone on a naval air station watches aircraft. The machines are beautiful and terrible, and it is human to look. But most people watch them the way people watch fireworks. The custodian watched them the way an old sailor watches the sea from a widow's walk. There was hunger in it and respect, and something underneath both of those that looked a great deal like grief. Osei found her that morning in the east passageway, restocking paper towels, and he asked her how long she had been at Cape Larkin. 3 years, she said. A little over. And before that, he asked. Something flickered behind her eyes and was gone so fast he almost let himself believe he had imagined it. Different work, she said. Nothing interesting. He told her he had a feeling it had been very interesting. He told her about the range, about the safe spot, and asked where a person learns to stand there. She told him she read a lot. He asked what she read at night. She told him there was not much else to do, boys. Then he said quietly that Senior Chief Bertolino had found a fuel weep on the number 4 aircraft that morning, and that he understood she had heard it from across a hangar without instruments. And Nora Vance went still. Not the stillness of a person who has stopped moving. The other kind. The stillness of a person actively holding something down with both hands. She said she had heard a hiss. She said anybody could have heard it. Osei said nobody else had. She said nobody else had been listening. He looked at her for a long moment, and Daniel Osei, who was not a stupid man, understood that he had walked all the way up to the edge of something, and that one more inch would close her permanently. So he stepped back. He wished her a good day. He walked to the end of the passageway, and then he turned around, and she was already restocking towels, already invisible, already nobody. And he stood there and made himself a promise that he would find out who she was. Not to expose her, not to hurt her, only because he was a noticing man, and there was a mystery standing in his passageway in gray coveralls, and he had never in his life been able to leave one alone. He did not know how little time he had left to solve it. At 4:30 that same morning, hours before any of it, Nora Vance had been pulling trash from the bins outside the radar and timing shed, and the door had been open, and Master Chief Gil Trammell had been alone inside at a console with every overhead light off but one. 11 years on that base, the most trusted technician at Cape Larkin. The man who trained the men who trained the technicians. He had commendations on the bulkhead of his shop, and a reputation so clean that his signature on a log was treated by everyone as the end of any argument. He had told her pleasantly enough that the door was supposed to be locked and that he would take the bag out himself. She had handed it to him and stepped back, and she had noticed 2 things, because noticing was the one habit 3 years of silence had not been able to sand out of her. The first was that a man who has come in early to do routine work does not turn the overheads off. The second was that Gil Trammell, in the entire 90 seconds she stood there, Never once downed the tablet in his left hand, not to take the bag, not to shake it open. He shifted the trash to his right arm and carried it awkwardly rather than put that tablet on the console beside him. She had filed it away, and then she had done the thing she had trained herself for 3 years to do, which was to keep pushing the cart. Because saying something meant being somebody, and she had made a promise to 9 people that she would never be somebody again. That night, she sat alone in her apartment with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and did what she did every night, which was to try very hard not to remember and to fail. She could still name all of them. Ozuna, who sang off-key over an open channel until she finally ordered him to stop and then spent 3 years wishing she had let him keep singing. Lou, who could put a crippled aircraft down in weather that had killed better pilots than either of them. Peyton, who was 23 years old and called her ma'am, even though she was barely more than a decade ahead of him, because that was how completely they had all trusted her. Nightjar's squadron. She had led them. 419 people had walked off a beach because of what those 9 pilots did, and the records had been sealed, and the men in the good suits had pinned a medal on her and told her the mission was a success and that she should be proud. She had gone home, taken off her flight suit, and never put it on again. She had made a promise that night to a room full of ghosts that she would never again hold a living pilot's life in her hands, that she would find some small, quiet corner of the world where her decisions could not kill anyone and disappear into it and stay there. She had kept that promise for 3 years. She set the cold tea down, pressed her fingers hard against her eyes, and whispered to no one, and to all of them, that she was sorry, that she was still sorry, that she would always be sorry. Out past the Northwest Cape, exactly as she had told Delia Ruiz it would, the squall line stacked itself higher and darker against the last of the light. And in a locked shed on the other side of the fence, in a maintenance log, nobody had any reason to open an entry set waiting under a signature no one would ever think to question. A routine recalibration of the radar timing system. Completely ordinary. Logged and signed at 3:40 in the morning, 11 days before anyone on Naval Air Station Cape Larkin would understand what it meant. The full wing evolution launched at 9, and by 9:15, Nora Vance was mopping the passageway outside the operations center, and by 9:22, she had stopped mopping entirely. She heard it before anyone said it out loud. That was the thing nobody would believe afterward. Through a prop door over 30 feet of tile, she heard the pitch of a room change. Routine chatter has a rhythm to it, lazy and overlapping people, finishing each other's sentences because nothing is at stake. That rhythm broke. It went clipped. Somebody said a word twice. Somebody else answered a half-second too fast in the specific register of a man trying very hard not to sound afraid. Nora Vance put both hands flat on the handle of her cart and did not move. Inside, the radar was not failing. It was fraying. That was the cruelty of it. If it had died all at once, they would have known instantly what they were dealing with and switched to procedure. Instead, the tracks began to flicker, drop, and reappear a mile from where they belonged, and the controllers chased them, and the picture of the sky slowly turned into a set of lies told confidently. A controller called for the backup array. Someone brought it up. The backup showed them exactly the same disintegrating nonsense because the backup ran on the same clock and nobody in that room in that moment had the time or the distance to realize it. 12 aircraft went invisible in 11 minutes. Out in the passageway, a custodian with a mop listened to a nightmare unfold that she recognized the way you recognize a voice on the phone. She told herself to keep pushing the cart. She told herself it was not her problem that there were 40 trained people in that room, and she was not one of them, that she had made a promise to 9 dead pilots, and the entire value of that promise was that it did not have exceptions. Then a controller read a fuel state aloud, and his voice climbed half an octave doing it, and Nora Vance understood the number. The number meant that somewhere off the Cape, 4 young pilots had lost their picture, their tanker plan, and their way home, and that the weather she had described to Delia Ruiz over a stack of message folders that morning was already closing the door behind them. They were going to become empty chairs. She knew exactly what empty chairs sounded like. She had lived inside that sound for 3 years. She let go of the cart. She crossed the threshold into the most restricted space on Naval Air Station Cape Larkin, in gray coveralls with a wet rag still hanging out of her back pocket, and for 2 full seconds, nobody noticed her at all because who notices the cleaning lady? Then a technician saw her, and shouted for somebody to get her out. A chief reached for the phone to call security. The whole room rounded on her with the fury of frightened people who have finally found something they can control. Nora Vance looked past every one of them at the main feed and read it in a single glance, the way she had once read a sky, and she spoke, and her voice was not the voice of a woman who cleaned decks. It was not the feed, she said. It was a phase alignment fault on the primary array cascading into the backups because the backups were slave to the same clock. Break the slave. Run the backup on independent timing. They would have a picture in 90 seconds. The room went completely silent. 40 people stopped and stared at a custodian who had just described their classified radar architecture with more precision than any of them could have managed on their best day, and the chief, with his hand halfway to the phone, froze exactly like that, fingers open, and forgot to close them. Captain Elias Ward turned around slowly. 52 years old, 200 combat missions, a man who had given briefs to admirals and taken orders from a president, and he looked at this small woman in coveralls and asked who the hell she was. She was not listening to him. She was already crossing the deck. She stopped behind the primary console where a technician who could not have been more than 23 sat with both hands frozen over a keyboard, and she did not order him out of the chair. That was the thing Ward would remember for the rest of his life. She crouched slightly so she was not above him. She told him there were pilots up there running out of time and that she could put them back on the scope and that he had to decide right now whether to let her because there was no version of this where he got to think about it. The kid looked into the eyes of the cleaning lady and did not see a cleaning lady. He saw the other thing he had only ever seen in two of his instructors and in exactly one Master Chief. He saw calm, not composure, not professionalism. Bottomless, impossible, almost frightening. Calm, the kind that only settles on a person who is standing on the far side of the worst thing that will ever happen to them. He stood up. He said, "Do it." Her hands moved, and every soul in that room watched a woman they had walked past 1,000 times reach into the heart of a failing military system with the unhurried certainty of somebody who had done impossible things before breakfast for a living. Ward stepped in behind her. He did not try to stop her. Some instinct older than any regulation told him that stopping this woman would be the last mistake of his career. He said quietly that she had done this before. She said without looking up a long time ago. He asked where. And Nora Vance, 3 years into a silence she had intended to carry to her grave, felt the whole weight of her old life come up through her chest like water rising in a hold. And she watched the first clean track resolve on the scope, and she answered him. Somewhere they told everybody she died. The tracks came home one by one. 4 of them, then 8, then 12 controllers scrambling to reestablish contact and up in the gray. A dozen frightened kids in $90 million machines heard their radios come back to life and would never know, most of them, that the reason they were going to make it home was a woman in coveralls sitting in a chair she had no legal right to occupy. The room started breathing again. Somebody actually laughed, and Nora Vance leaned toward the scope and said very quietly, "Captain." Ward leaned in. At the edge of the picture where the timing fault had opened a hole nobody had known existed, 6 contacts were coming in low off the water under the fog. The blood went out of Elias Ward's face. He said that was not ours. She said no, it was not. And it had not wandered in. It had come in through a door that had been propped open 11 minutes ago and was closing again right now, which meant somebody had known the exact size and shape and duration of that door. The alarm started somewhere in the building. A different alarm, the one they practiced for twice a year and never once believed. Daniel Osei came through the hatch at a dead run with the 2 of his people behind him, and he stopped as if he had walked into a wall, because there she was at the center of it, at the console with the entire room orbiting her. He said it out loud without meaning to. "It was you. It was always you." Nora Vance did not answer him because she was doing an arithmetic. She asked Ward for the alert package. 20 minutes out at the neighboring station because Cape Larkin's own alert birds were down for the evolution, which every person in that room understood instantly was another thing somebody had known. She asked for the fuel state on the 4 aircraft still airborne. 8 minutes of usable, maybe 9 on the lead. She asked how many pilots on this base had ever flown against a real adversary. Nobody answered, which was the answer. She stood up out of the chair, and the coveralls hung on her exactly the way they had 90 seconds earlier. But everyone in that space felt something change, and Ward found himself straightening without deciding to the way a man straightens when a superior officer enters a room. She said she needed a flight suit and she needed it now. The words hung there. Nobody moved. So she said them again, and this time there was steel underneath, and she gave Ward the arithmetic out loud so he would not have the luxury of thinking about it. 4 kids with 8 minutes of gas, 6 hostels between them and the runway, an alert package 20 minutes out, and every second he spent staring at her was a second one of them died. She said she would ask exactly once. Was he going to help her or watch her? Elias Ward had flown 200 missions. He had been shot at over 3 countries, and standing in front of a woman in coveralls with dirty water drying on her collar. He felt something he had not felt since he was a lieutenant, which was small. He said, "Get her a suit." A young officer started to say she was a civilian, that she had no clearance to be in this space, let alone. Ward roared it the second time. The kid ran. Osei stepped into her path, and he was not trying to stop her. He simply could not make his mouth work in any other order. He said she was going to fly. He said she was a janitor and she was going to climb into a strike fighter and fly. And for 1 second, the mask came off and Daniel Osei saw her face and his throat closed because what was on it was grief. An ocean of it. The face of a woman being asked to walk back into the room where everyone she loved had died. She told him she had never been a janitor. She said she had only needed to be one for a while. Then she was moving, and 40 people who 12 minutes earlier had not known her name parted in front of her like water off a bow. Delia Ruiz was pressed against the far bulkhead with her folders clutched to her chest, and she had said good morning to that woman 400 times, and she had brought her a cup of coffee one freezing January morning on an impulse and never forgotten how startled she had looked. And now every strange thing she had ever noticed arranged itself into one shape. The weather, the engine sounds, the way her eyes tracked aircraft across the sky like she was flying them from the ground. Ruiz said, "Oh my God," out loud to nobody. She said, "It was you the whole time, and we made you clean our floors." Nora heard it. She did not stop walking, but as she passed, she said so quietly that only Delia Ruiz would ever be able to swear. It happened that Ruiz had been kind to her and that she had not forgotten it. Then she was through the hatch, and Petty Officer Second Class Delia Ruiz put her hands over her face and burst into tears without fully understanding why. The word went across that flight line the way fire crosses dry grass. The janitor. The janitor was going to fly. Plane captains stopped mid-task. Sailors came out of the maintenance bays at a jog. And standing in the middle of it, still in his own flight suit, having recovered 40 minutes before the world turned upside down, was Cody Brantley. He saw her coming across the tarmac in a borrowed flight suit that hung on her like it had been cut for her, moving with a purpose that made the crowd go quiet in front of her, and something in him came loose. He stepped into her path and said no. He said this was a joke, somebody tell him it was a joke. He said she could not hold a mop straight, and they were putting her in his aircraft. Nora Vance stopped in front of him. For 3 years, she had absorbed everything this young man had thrown at her, the insults, the laughter, the bucket that morning, the bruise blooming right now on her hip under the flight suit where nobody could see it. She had taken all of it in silence because silence was the price of being nobody, and being nobody had been the only way she knew how to survive. She was not nobody anymore. She told him calmly that he had 400 flight hours, and every single one of them had happened in good weather, inside a training area, with a wingman, a tanker, and an entire continent between him and anybody who wanted him dead. She told him she had flown missions that did not have names, missions whose records had been burned. She had brought aircraft home that had no business flying, and she had watched aircraft fall out of the sky that she could not reach, and she had carried the weight of every one of them for 3 years while he laughed at her across a hangar. She stepped in closer, and Cody Brantley, who did not have any fear, took a step back. She told him to get out of her way before those pilots did to Hannah Ward's flight what she had already lived through once, because she was not going to bury another squadron. Not while she could still fly. His mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. And Ray Bertolino, 24 years on that flight line, stepped up beside her, looked at Brantley and said, "The thing that ended it. Move, Lieutenant. The lady has work to do." Brantley moved. She went up the ladder, and the crowd on that tarmac made a sound, a collective intake of breath, because there is no faking that. You can fake a resume. You can fake a story. You cannot fake the way a body knows a machine it has loved. Bertolino followed her up running systems with her, and he kept opening his mouth to explain something. and kept finding she was already ahead of him, already reaching for the switch he was about to name, already reading a display before he could point at it. Halfway through, he simply stopped talking. He said, and his voice cracked doing it, that he had been at this 24 years and he needed to know who she was. She pulled the visor down and gave him 2 words. Ghost 6. She told him to clear her ladder. Ray Bertolino went down that ladder like his legs had forgotten their job, and he stood on the tarmac afterward with his hat in his hands and did not move for a long time. In the operations center, the tower assigned the call sign, and it appeared on the board, and Elias Ward saw it and put one hand flat on the console to keep himself upright. Osei asked what was wrong. Ward said that every pilot his age knew that call sign. He said 3 years ago there had been an evacuation off a coastal aid station that was about to be overrun and a squadron had gone in against numbers. No reasonable person would have flown against to cover the people on that beach. He said 419 civilians walked off. He said 9 pilots did not come back. He said one did. One held the whole thing together long enough for those people to get clear, and they sealed the file and pinned a medal on her, and then she walked off the face of the earth because she could not stand to wear it. Osei asked her call sign. Ward said Ghost 6. The 2 men looked at each other, and then they turned toward the window and watched a single strike fighter taxi toward the duty runway with a calm and terrible grace. And somewhere behind them, at the back of that crowded operations center, standing quietly with his arms folded where he had been standing since the fault began, Master Chief Gil Trammell watched the same aircraft roll, and Daniel Osei, who was a noticing man, noticed that in a room where every single face had gone white, the most trusted technician on Naval Air Station Cape Larkin did not look surprised at all. She killed the jammer in 11 seconds, and it cost her almost everything she had left. She came at it from below with 2 fighters converging behind her, and she did not maneuver because maneuvering meant losing the geometry, and losing the geometry meant coming around for a second pass she did not have the fuel or the body for. So she flew straight and level with 2 of the best pilots the enemy fielded, closing on her back, and she counted, and she took the shot, and the orbiting aircraft came apart above her. And across the entire Oregon coast, the radios came back. In the operations center, it happened all at once, 40 channels blooming into life, controllers hearing voices they had not heard in 26 minutes. The tower at Cape Larkin suddenly able to speak to the alert package inbound, and for about 2 seconds the room was pure noise and relief. Then a technician said the 2 remaining hostiles were on her. Ward said, "Get out of the way," and put both hands on the console. Nora Vance had nothing left. She knew it with the flat clarity she had always reserved for the worst moments. Her arms had gone past numb into a kind of dead weight she had to consciously command. Her ribs had turned every breath into a negotiation. She had one more real maneuver in her, and after that, her body would simply stop taking orders, and whatever came next would happen without her participation. They caught her in a scissors, one high and one low, working her back and forth between them, and for the first time in the entire fight, she was reacting instead of dictating. And both of those pilots knew it, and they pressed with the desperate ferocity of men who had watched this woman dismantle 5 of their brothers and wanted more than they had ever wanted anything to see her come apart. She said out loud in the cockpit, not on any channel, that she did not have anything left. She said, "Ozuna Lou Payton." She said, "Somebody help me." And on the ground, they heard her voice change. That was what broke the base. Not the odds, not the losses, not the impossible things she had done. It was the sound of Ghost 6 finally sounding tired, finally sounding human. Because if she was afraid, then it was real, and if it was real, then the story they had all started to believe in might have a different ending. Delia Ruiz put her hand over her mouth. Ray Bertolino took his hat off and held it against his chest without knowing he had done it. Elias Ward grabbed the radio himself, and his voice shook, and he did not care. He told her the alert package was 7 minutes out. He told her she did not have to win, she only had to live. Break off, disengage, run, stay alive, let them come to her. He said she had done enough. He said she had done more than enough. And 40,000 feet above him, being hunted by 2 men with nothing left in her arms and gray closing at the edges of her sight, Nora Vance heard the word enough. She had heard it before, 3 years ago in a room with a flag in it from men in good suits who had pinned a medal on her chest and told her she had saved 419 people and had done enough, more than enough, and she had gone home and taken off her flight suit and never put it on again, and she had spent every day since learning that enough is the loneliest word in the English language when you are the only one left alive to hear it. She said no. She said it on the open channel so the entire base heard her. She told Ward that she ran once, that she flew away and let them tell her she had done enough and she had spent 3 years dying of it. She said she was not running today, not from two, not from anybody, not ever again. And then with the last of everything she had, she stopped defending. She reversed into the teeth of the scissors, straight at both of them, a move so aggressive and so hopeless and so completely indifferent to her own survival that both enemy pilots flinched because nothing in their training had prepared them for an opponent who was out of energy, out of options, out of body, and coming at them anyway. The low man broke first, hauling off her nose on pure animal instinct, and in braking he crossed in front of his own wingman. For about a quarter of a second, the geometry of three aircraft resolved into a single impossible solution that only a pilot with 30 years in a cockpit and 3 years pushing a mop could ever have seen coming, and Nora Vance took it, and then there was one. The operations center did not cheer. They had learned. One can still kill you, and every person in that room knew it. And Ward, watching the track, saw what Osei saw a half-second later, which was that she was not flying like herself anymore. The turns had gone a fraction slow. The precision that had carved through 6 aircraft was fraying at the edges. Osei said she was running out. Ward said not of fuel. Alone in a clear sky, with the last man of a formation that had come to erase Cape Larkin from the map, Nora Vance keyed the mic and did the thing that half the people listening would never fully understand and would talk about for the rest of their lives. She offered him a way home. She told him he was the last one and that he knew it because he had watched it happen. She told him 5 of his friends were gone and she was still here and he could not beat her, not today, not in her weather, not in her house. Her breath rasped in the mask, and even that somehow made the words heavier instead of weaker. Then she told him she did not want him dead. She said she had buried a squadron. She said she had carried 9 people every single day for 3 years, and that she was so tired of watching young men fall out of the sky that she could barely hold the stick. She told him she was going to give him what nobody had given her, which was a way to live. Turn around, fly home. Tell them what happened here. Tell them there was one defender and she was enough. There was silence on the channel. The whole base hung on the answer of a man none of them had ever met a man. Nora Vance was trying to save with 2 broken ribs and an empty tank in a body that was quitting on her in pieces. Then the last track turned east and ran. He broke off, and he bassu, and he fled that sky as fast as his aircraft would carry him, and she watched him go and did not chase, could not have chased, and would not have chased, even with fuel and strength and a clear conscience, because she had meant every single word. She said mostly to herself, that was the last one. She said it was over, and the operations center did not erupt. That was the thing every person in that room would remember until they died. Nobody cheered. A silence came down over 40 people that was deeper than the silence of the crisis, because a cheer is what you give when your side scores. And this was not that. Grown officers stood with tears running down their faces and made no sound at all, and nobody looked away, and nobody thought less of anybody because half the room was doing it. Osei was the one who finally spoke, and his voice came out cracked. He said she had him. He said she had him dead to rights, empty and exhausted and broken, and she let him live. He turned to Ward and asked who a person like that even is, not the call sign, not the file, who fights like that for 26 minutes and spends the whole time trying to save the men, trying to kill her. Ward said she was what all of them pretended to be, and almost none of them were. Then he said they had made her clean their floors for 3 years and never once learned her name. But it was not over, because now she had to get down. The adrenaline that had carried her through the entire engagement drained out of her all at once, and what it left behind was a fatigue so total that she nearly lost consciousness straight and level with an empty sky around her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the controls that had just done impossible things. She called the tower, and her voice had changed. It had gone thin. The calm had finally cracked now that the danger belonged to nobody but her. She said threats were clear. She said she was in trouble. She said she had nothing left, and she did not know if she could put the aircraft on the ground. Ward was on the radio instantly, the grief gone, the commander back. She told him her status was that she was 46 years old and had just fought 6 people after 3 years off. And there was a ghost of dark humor in it, the gallows laugh of a pilot who has always joked at exactly the wrong moment. She told him her arms were done. She told him about the ribs. Then she told him the weather she had used as a weapon was now sitting between her and the field, and that she had flown into it fresh and had no idea whether she could fly through it wrung out. She did not finish the sentence. Nobody in that room needed her to. Ward told her she was not going through it. He told her to go around the southern edge, slow and gentle, that they had fuel state on her, and she had the margin, and that there would be no more heroics today because she had already saved everybody, and now she was going to let him bring her home. And Nora Vance, who had spent 3 years convinced that the kindest thing she could do for the world was subtract herself from it, heard the commanding officer of a naval air station beg her to come home, and heard behind him the sound of a room full of people who suddenly and desperately wanted her to live, and something in her chest that had been frozen solid since a beach 3 years ago began painfully to come apart. She said, okay. She said, southern edge, slow and gentle. She said she would try. Down on the flight line, the word moved through the crowd like a cold front. She won, and now she might not make it back. The celebration that had been building in 300 throats died all at once. Bertolino was already running for the crash crews, shouting at them to stage. Ruiz stood with both hands over her mouth. And Cody Brantley got up off the concrete and ran flat out across the tarmac toward the operations center because he could not stand on the sidelines one more second, because he had to be in the room even if all he could do was be in it. He came through the hatch just as her track began its slow, careful arc around the southern edge, and Ward turned to bark at whoever had barged in and saw who it was and said nothing, because the face on that young man was not the face of the lieutenant from the ready room. It was the face of a boy who had just watched the entire world turn out to be arranged differently than he had believed. He asked if she was going to make it. His voice barely worked. He said, please. Ward told him he did not know, and the honesty of it. Captain to lieutenant told Cody Brantley everything about how bad it was. She fought her own body for 11 minutes on that arc. Every small correction cost her more than it should have. Twice her vision tunneled down to almost nothing, and she had to breathe through it and talk the blood back up and argue herself out of the dark. She muttered at herself to stay with it. She told Peyton again that he had always said she was too stubborn to die. Then the field opened up ahead of her through the thinning gray, and the sight of it put something back into her that the exhaustion had taken out. She called the tower and said Go 6 was on final and she was going to try to put it down. And then she said if she did not, that Ward should tell those young pilots something for her. She said, tell them the loudest one in the room is almost never the strongest. Tell them the quiet ones are quiet because they have already seen what happens when you are not. Ward said she was going to tell them herself. He said she was going to walk into a classroom and tell them herself. He told her to bring his airplane home. And every soul on Naval Air Station Cape Larkin, in the operations center, and in the crash trucks, and in the ready room, where a dozen young pilots who had mocked her stood in shattered silence, watched a single strike fighter come down out of the murk on the ragged edge of everything, flown by a pair of arms with nothing left in them and a heart that refused to quit. The tires touched. The whole base rose to its feet as one and did not make a sound. The aircraft rolled out and stopped, and for 3 full seconds, nothing happened, and those 3 seconds were the longest of Elias Ward's life. The canopy stayed shut, the engine wound down, and 300 people stood frozen, terrified that she had spent the last of herself on the last 100 feet and had nothing left to open it with. Ward whispered at the glass for her to show him. The canopy came up slowly, painfully, but it came up and a gloved hand appeared over the rail, and then a helmet, and Nora Vance pulled herself upright in the seat like a woman 3 times her age and sat there in the open air alive. And then the sound came. It started somewhere on the flight line as one voice, and it spread and it grew until the whole base was roaring a name. Most of them had learned less than an hour earlier, and she sat in that cockpit and did not understand it at first because 3 years of being invisible had trained the ability to believe a crowd could be cheering for her right out of her. She looked down at the faces flooding toward the aircraft, and something that had been sealed for 3 years broke open, and Nora Vance, who had not cried in front of another human being since the day her squadron died, put her hand over her mouth and wept. Bertolino reached the ladder first and went up, It 2 rungs at a time, faster than a man his age had any business moving. He did not salute and he did not speak. He reached into the cockpit and took her shaking hand in both of his and held on. He said in 24 years he had never seen anything like it. Not in training, not anywhere. He said there was not a pilot alive who could have done what she just did. Then his voice went completely, and he said, "And we made you clean our floors." She told him he had cleared her ladder when she needed it cleared, and that was all a pilot ever really needs, somebody to clear the ladder. Then she asked him to help an old woman down because her legs were not going to manage it alone. When her boots touched the tarmac, the crowd surged forward and then stopped all at once, as if some shared instinct told 300 people that this woman had given enough of herself today and did not need to be swarmed. They opened into a wide circle instead, and then they did the only thing that felt like it fit. Every uniform on that flight line came to attention and saluted the janitor. She did not know what to do with her hands while 300 people held a salute for her, and so she stood there swaying against Bertolino's arm until the circle parted and Cody Brantley came through it. The flight line went quiet in a different way, a wary way, because every person out there had watched what he did to this woman that morning. They had seen the bucket go under the nose gear. They had seen the water on her hands and knees. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment, he could not speak at all. Then he said that this morning he had kicked her bucket across the deck in front of everybody. He said he had spilled water on her and laughed while she cleaned it up and told her she was trash near real aircraft. He was shaking. He said that 4 hours later, she had climbed into his squadron's airplane and flown alone against 6 people so that nobody else would ever have to, and that she had sent Hannah Ward home and that she had sent the last enemy home alive. He said he had spent his whole career believing he was the best scores, best hands, and he had stood on that tarmac and listened to her do things he would study for the rest of his life and never come close to. And the entire time she had been trying to keep the men trying to kill her from dying. Then he broke. He said he was sorry. He said there was no way to make it right, and he knew it, and he just needed her to hear him say it out loud. Everybody waited to see what she would do. She would have been within every right to turn her back and let him drown in it. Half the flight line expected exactly that. Instead, she reached out with an arm that could barely lift and put her hand on his shoulder and told him to look at her. She said what he had just done took more courage than anything she did in the air. She said flying was easy for her. It was the one thing she knew how to do. But standing in front of a base full of people and admitting out loud that you were wrong to the person you wronged is the hard thing, and most men never manage it once in a whole life. And then she did not absolve him, which is the part nobody expected. She told him he was going to stand in front of a board. She told him he was going to tell them exactly what he had done in those words without a single softening, and he was going to accept whatever they handed him and not appeal it. She said forgiveness was hers to give, and consequences were not, and that a man who only apologizes when the person he hurt turns out to be a legend has not actually learned anything yet. She said good pilots do not come from being forgiven. They come from paying. Cody Brantley said yes, ma'am, and he meant it, and Elias Ward grounded him 90 days pending inquiry before the sun went down. Then Hannah Ward came through the crowd, still in her flight suit, and stopped in front of Nora Vance with an expression nobody could read. She said, "You are the voice." She said she had 4 aircraft, low on fuel and contacts she could not see, and she was about to come apart, and a voice told her, every one of them was going home tonight. She said she took her flight and left because she was ordered to, and she had hated herself every second since, because she was the flight lead, and she ran and left a single defender to do her job. Nora started to speak, and Hannah said, "Let me finish." She said her father had been flying for 30 years, and when she was small, he used to tell her about the pilots he admired, and there was one he came back to more than all the others. A pilot who went into something so bad they sealed the file. A pilot who got 419 people off a beach and lost her whole squadron doing it, and then vanished off the face of the earth. She said he told her that if she ever became half that pilot, he would die a proud man. She said the call sign was Go 6. She said she grew up on those stories. She said that woman was the reason she flew at all, and she had spent her entire career trying to be worthy of somebody she believed was dead. Then she said that today the pilot she had worshipped since she was 6 years old came up on her radio and saved her life, and she had not even known it was her. There was not a dry eye anywhere on that flight line. And Nora Vance, who had spent 3 years certain that her story had ended and that Ghost 6 was a ghost who mattered to nobody, learned in the middle of a tarmac that a little girl had grown up on her name and become a fighter pilot because of it. She took Hannah Ward's face in both hands and told her fiercely that she had not run. She said she had followed an order from somebody who had been exactly where she was and knew what had to happen. And that is not cowardice. That is discipline, and it is the hardest thing a leader ever does, trusting somebody else to carry the weight so you can protect your people. She said, Hannah got 4 pilots home alive today. 4. That was the whole job. That was the only job. Then she said her father was wrong about one thing and that Hannah was not half the pilot she was, that the way she held that flight together when everything went dark was already better than Nora had been at her age. She said, tell him Host 6 said his daughter is the real thing. And up in the tower, a man with 200 combat missions who could see all of it and hear none of it put both hands over his face and wept like a boy. 20 minutes later, the alert package finally arrived, 6 fresh fighters screaming in to defend an airspace. One woman had already cleared, and they circled the field asking the tower where the threats were. Ward had to tell them there were none. The lead pilot, a hardened major with real combat time, refused to believe it and asked which squadron the defender was from. Ward said no squadron, one pilot, call sign Ghost 6. There was a long silence on that frequency. Then the major came back, and his voice had changed, gone quiet and almost frightened, and he said, Ghost 6 is a story they tell in ready rooms. He said, Ghost 6 is not real. He said, Ghost 6 died 3 years ago. Ward looked down through the tower glass at the small figure on the tarmac, surrounded by 300 saluting sailors, and said that Ghost 6 had been cleaning their floors for 3 years and that today she came back. That night, Nora Vance did not go home. She sat in a borrowed office with maintenance logs and personnel access records and a cold cup of coffee that Delia Ruiz kept replacing, and Daniel Osei sat across from her, and neither of them slept. Around 2 in the morning, he said she knew what she was looking for. It was not a question. He had watched her go down columns of data for 4 hours and had realized she was not reading it the way an investigator reads. She was reading it the way she read weather. She said she knew what it felt like. She said real sabotage is messy. It leaves fingerprints. It breaks things it did not mean to break. It looks like what it is. This did not. This was surgical, which meant whoever did it knew exactly how much to touch and exactly how much to leave alone. She said that was not a technician following instructions from a handler overseas. That was somebody who understood that system down to the bone. Somebody who had been there a long time. Somebody nobody would ever suspect because he was too good at his job. Osei said she was describing half his senior maintenance staff. She said she was describing one of them, and she had not found which one yet. By dawn, she had. It was buried where nobody would look a single line 11 days before the attack. A routine recalibration of the radar timing system. Log sign completely ordinary, the kind of entry that scrolls past 100 sets of eyes without registering. She slid it across the desk and told him to read the timestamp. Osei read it, 3:40 in the morning. She said nobody recalibrates a timing system at 3:40. There is no reason to. The system is not in use, but you also do not schedule delicate work for the middle of the night when you are alone and unobserved. Unless being alone and unobserved is the entire point. She tapped the signature line and asked whose name that was. Osei looked and his face changed. Master Chief Gil Trammell. 11 years. Commendations on his bulkhead. The man who trained the men who trained the technicians. The last person on Naval Air Station, Cape Larkin, anybody would ever look at twice. Nora said he was the only person it could have been. She said that recalibration did not fix anything. It planted the fault 11 days early, dormant, armed, waiting to trigger inside a specific window, and the window was yesterday's evolution. He did not break the radar during the attack. He had already broken it. He armed it, and he waited, and then he stood at the back of that room with his arms folded and watched 40 people scramble to fix a failure he had designed, knowing precisely why they would never find the cause in time. She said he watched a base full of his own people get ready to die, and he never blinked. Then she told him about 4:30 in the morning, 11 days earlier, a shed with the overheads off, and a man who would not put down a tablet long enough to take a bag of trash out of her hands. Osei asked why she had not said anything. She said because saying something meant being somebody, and she had promised 9 dead pilots that she would never be somebody again. She said she would carry that for the rest of her life. Then he asked her the question that changed the shape of everything, which was where a Master Chief gets a fault that precise. And she told him he did not. She said a man like Trammell could plan it, but somebody had to hand it to him because that exploit lived inside the timing architecture itself in a maintenance patch that had come from the contractor, and that meant the door had been built at a desk in an office building by people in clean shirts long before it was ever open on this coast. Osei sat back very slowly and said that was not one trader. She said no, it was one trader and one company. And the company had been quietly selling the same architecture with the same undisclosed backdoor to buyers on 3 continents, and Gil Trammell was only the hand on the latch. Then Osei's phone rang. He listened. Nora watched his face empty out. He hung up and said Trammell had not shown up for his shift. First time in 11 years. And 20 minutes ago, a fuel truck had gone missing from the flight line motor pool. She was already moving. Half the wing was parked out there wingtip to wingtip. He was not running. He was finishing the job because if he could not let the enemy take the base, he was going to take it himself, and one fuel truck into that row was all it would require. They came out onto the flight line, and it was already rolling slow and deliberate down the taxiway, past a checkpoint that had waved through a face it had trusted for 11 years, with nothing between him and the aircraft but open concrete. Osei said security could not get there in time. Nora Vance looked at the geometry and saw a heavy aircraft tug idling by the maintenance bay with its engines still warm. She ran for it with 2 cracked ribs and no sleep, and Osei shouting her name behind her, and she got it out onto the taxiway and put it broadside across the path and stopped. And then she stayed in the seat. That was the part Osei understood a half-second too late to stop. If she got out and ran, Trammell would simply swerve around a parked tug and the whole thing would be for nothing. The only way to stop a man who is willing to die is to make him believe you are willing to die too. She keyed the tug radio to the base frequency, and her voice went out across the entire station calm as it had been at 40,000 feet. She said, Trammell, this is the janitor. She said the one who was standing 40 feet from the operations center when he pulled his trigger, the one who ruined 11 years of his work in 26 minutes yesterday. She said she was sitting in a tug directly in his path and she was not going to move. He could stop the truck and face what he had done, like a man, or he could drive through her and add murder to treason and still not reach those aircraft, because there was a security cordon forming behind her and he would be dead before he cleared the wreckage. Then she said the thing that ended it. She said she had already died once 3 years ago in a sky he would never understand. She said the fear he was counting on, the fear that makes people get out of the way, she gave that up a long time ago. She told him to stop the truck. He did not. Bertolino screamed her name. Ruiz turned her face away. Ward came out of the tower at a dead run, shouting into a radio nobody was listening to. And Cody Brantley grounded, who had slept on a cot in the ready room because he could not bear to leave the building, sprinted onto the tarmac screaming at her to move. She folded her hands in her lap. 50 feet, 40, 30. And Nora Vance sat perfectly still and let Gil Trammell see her face through the glass, let him see that she was not going to flinch and was not going to run and was not going to give him the one thing his entire plan now depended on. And she dared him without a word to become the man he would have to be to drive through her. At 20 feet, he stood on the brakes. The truck skidded and shuddered and stopped with the bumper, close enough that she could read his face, and what was on it was not defiance. It was collapse. The collapse of a man whose nerve had finally broken against something harder than himself. The cordon closed. It was over. She climbed down and walked to the door as they pulled him out, and she did not shout at him and did not gloat. She said, 11 years and these people trusted you. She said, Bertolino cleared airplanes beside you, and these kids learned the trade from your hands, and you were going to let every one of them burn. She said she had watched 9 people she loved die, and he had been ready to trade a whole base full of people who trusted him for money. She stepped back and let them take him, and told him she hoped whoever paid him thought it was worth a soul, because he had sold his and he had not even gotten the base. Trammell drew life without parole. The contractor's executives were indicted 8 months later, and the back door came out of the timing architecture at every naval air station in the country. and the mandatory independent audit statute that followed carried the name of the aid station her squadron died covering. The file was unsealed by act of the secretary, 419 names and 9. A rear admiral flew out to offer her reinstatement, her rank back, and more a squadron of her own. She turned it down. She told him she had done the arithmetic every day for 3 years, 419, saved against 9 lost, and told herself the 9 outweighed the 419 because the 9 were hers. That was why she disappeared. Not because she could not fly, because she could not stand to be responsible for a living person ever again. Then she stood in a passageway and watched what happens when the only person who can see the threat has removed herself from the room. She said she did not want a command. She said one pilot in the right place can save hundreds, which meant the most useful thing she could do, with the years she had left, was not to be that pilot, but to make 100 of them. She asked for the schoolhouse. And months later, she stood in front of a room of pilots, so young it hurt to look at them and read the doubt on their faces, the way she had read it her whole life, and let them keep it for a moment, because she had earned the right to enjoy that particular silence. She told them her name. She told them about the mop. Then she gave them the 2 things the sky had cost her 9 friends to teach her. Never underestimate the person standing beside you. The mechanic, the controller, the one who does not talk much. The quietest person in the room is very often quiet because they have already survived the thing the rest of you are still afraid of. And for the humble ones, the ones like her, humility is a beautiful thing, right up until it becomes an excuse. When people are dying and you have what they need, being small is just cowardice wearing a nicer coat. Walk into the room. Years went by. Cody Brantley served every day of his 90, came back different, and made commander, and never once for the rest of his career walked past a person in coveralls without stopping to learn their name. Hannah Ward took her own squadron and hung one photograph in her office, a small gray-haired woman at a lectern, and 4 words beneath it, the pilot who saved me. Ray Bertolino retired and brought his grandchildren to watch a demonstration flight and told them the story of the janitor, and every word of it was true. And above the door of the new training facility at Cape Larkin, 9 names were cut into the stone so that no pilot could walk into that building without reading them first. They judged a woman by her uniform instead of her character. They mistook her silence for weakness and her humility for the absence of worth. They looked at the quietest person in the room and saw nobody at all, and she turned out to be the greatest story any of them would ever tell. The quietest person in the room is very often carrying the greatest story you will ever hear. Learn their name.